Vladimir Putin is having a bit of a moment. For perhaps the first time since he bungled the invasion of Ukraine almost 2 years ago, the Russian leader appears to have the upper hand. More of his troops have died in the war, but he has a far greater pool of manpower to draw from, giving him greater staying power, and he has placed Russia's economy on a war footing, meaning his factories are pumping out more firepower as well. But disappointment in Ukraine's counter-offensive and its mounting death toll are masking problems that still lurk deep within Russia's ranks. If you look just a little harder, this is why Putin's hand is weaker than it first appears. For starters, Russia has already launched one failed offensive so far this year. It began all the way back in July, when Putin's generals massed 100,000 men for an attack on Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, via the town of Kupiansk in the east. But the attack has fallen flat after advancing just a few kilometers and has now all but petered out, with little significant territory changing hands for weeks. Off the back of that, Russia is now trying to advance from another direction, this time up from the south through the town of Avdiivka. But this has turned into a complete bloodbath. Kiev claims hundreds of men and dozens of tanks and other armoured vehicles are being destroyed each day. It could well be that Avdiivka is the bloodiest battle of the entire war to date. Worse even than the Battle of Bakhmut, which smashed the Wagner group to bits and drove leader Yevgeny Prigozhin to attempt a coup. But in Avdiivka, it is Russia's own army that is taking the brunt of the casualties, rather than a ragtag mercenary group made up of psychopaths, military dropouts, and conscripted convicts. And that creates several problems for Putin. First, it shows that his army is no better at taking ground than the Ukrainians, despite the vast overmatch in numbers of virtually everything. Even after Putin recruited hundreds of thousands of soldiers, bought 1 million artillery shells from North Korea, and forced his factories to run triple shifts turning out extra equipment, he can't break the deadlock. And it's hard to see how anything else he might do, short of dropping a nuclear bomb, which ally China has warned him not to do, could drastically shift that balance. All of which wouldn't be a problem if he was content to sit behind his defences and simply wait until Ukraine was ready to strike a peace deal. But as the offensive in Avdiivka shows, he isn't willing to do that. At least not yet. He has promised his people that he will liberate the whole of the Donbass, and he seems intent on keeping that promise, even if that means killing thousands of men and blowing up billions of dollars in military gear just to gain a few miles of burned-out wasteland. Which brings us to the next problem that Putin faces: keeping support for his war going at home, even as the costs of that war ramp up and the victories become few and far between. The Russian army may have held off Ukraine's counterattack, but the Russian people have not had anything to celebrate since Bakhmut fell 6 months ago. Meanwhile, life has become harder in Russia, and what little polling there is of public opinion suggests most people believe it will get worse still before it gets better. That may seem like a trivial detail, but next year is technically an election year for Putin. Of course, there's absolutely no doubt that he is going to win, but he is thought to be nervous about the result, and perhaps with good reason. Many experts believed Putin would have carried out another round of military mobilization by now to boost his reserves, and the fact that he hasn't is because he fears causing unrest before the ballot. Discontent does seem to be building. Recently, Russian women whose husbands had been drafted onto the front line started a grassroots campaign calling for them to come home. And another recent poll found Russians favour peace talks over more fighting by 10 percentage points, the first time that has been the case since Putin ordered the invasion. If that translates into a hit for his personal popularity, then the vote rigging he typically relies on to boost his numbers will need to take place on a much larger scale than usual, and it will be harder for the average Russian to ignore. At the risk of stating the obvious, Putin doesn't need the Russian people to like him or his war, but he does need them to passively accept their fate. Any signs of resistance will be a serious source of worry for the Kremlin in the year ahead. Even if Putin makes it through the vote unscathed, as most people expect, the war is imposing costs in other ways that will be much harder for him to ignore as time goes on. Russia is vast and has a lot of resources, but they are not limitless. Take the manpower example. The country was already in a population slump before the war began, and the outlook is now significantly worse. Unemployment dropped to just 3% back in April, which sounds like good news until you realise that it's only because so many working-age men have been sent off to fight. Roughly 1 million more have fled the country to dodge the draft. That has caused a labour shortage, which has driven wages up, causing inflation, which has seen interest rates rise to 15%, treble the UK's rate, and they may rise even further. An imbalance in imports and exports has also hurt the ruble, all of which hits Russians and their businesses in the pocket, including the elites that Putin relies on for his power. But unlike in the West, where the government would step in to help, Putin is too busy financing his war. In recent days, he signed a budget that allocates 1/3 of all government spending next year to the military, triple what it cost in peacetime. And to fund that massive increase, he is taking money from other things like education, infrastructure, and healthcare. To put it another way, he's selling Russia's future to pay for its present, none of which matters right now, but all of which can and will come back to bite him at some point, whether that's months or years from now. On top of which, Ukraine refuses to lie down. Despite its counter-offensive failure, Kiev is still taking ground and has made advances around the Dnipro River in recent weeks. Marines are now crossing the waterway with apparent ease and taking territory on the opposite bank. This doesn't provide much of an advantage for now, but it could do in the future, leaving the option of a larger attack open that would bypass most of the defences blocking Crimea, which may be just enough to persuade Ukraine's Western allies to keep supplies of weapons and ammo flowing. In recent days, the first American Abrams tanks have arrived on the front lines. More will follow. And long-awaited F-16 fighters will arrive at some point next year. Meanwhile, Western arms companies like Germany's Rheinmetall are moving to set up in the country as Kiev looks to set itself up for a long war. Ukraine's success at driving Russia's navy away from its Black Sea coast has also allowed it to restart grain shipments, a vital economic lifeline that is keeping the country in the fight. And President Zelensky insists Ukraine is on the cusp of being given warships to help keep the route open long into the future. To be sure, 2023 could have gone a lot better for Ukraine. Wishful thinking about its counter-offensive led many to assume the war would be half won by now, with Russia scrambling to avoid total defeat. That clearly hasn't happened, and Putin is heading into 2024 with the upper hand. But his situation is far from perfect. Despite all of Russia's battlefield advantages, he still cannot end the war the way he wants, with Kiev and the West cowed and Ukraine's eastern regions fully under his control. And there is no sign that that is about to change anytime soon. Even if he manages to take Avdiivka, the feat will be so expensive that it will take a long time before he can attempt it again. And there are dozens more Avdiivkas waiting for him on the road to seizing the whole of the Donbass. Even a country as big and resourceful as Russia will struggle to swallow those kinds of losses. All the while, the cost of the war mounts. Soldiers die, life gets harder, and discontent festers. Vladimir Putin is betting that a long war is his route to victory, but his hand is not as strong as he and his supporters might like to think.